I'm delighted to be with you this morning. To admit that I've always sort of wanted to visit Oakdale. I have long been an admirer of Aidan Ballou, your congregation's founding minister, and his philosophy of pacifism and civil disobedience. And so it's great to be in the pulpit that he once occupied many decades ago. I'm also happy to be here to give a sermon on universalism, which I would like to think of as a little bit in the spirit of Ballou's faith. Before I returned to the academy, when I was a parish minister in Cleveland, Ohio, I made it a point every year to offer at least one sermon on an aspect of Black theology during Black History Month. And a few years ago, I focused on a kind of universalism that the scholar Joanne Braxton calls organic universalism. In her words, organic universalism is a theological tradition that resists the division of humanity into the saved and the damned, and is concerned with the souls of all beings. She believes that organic universalism is a theological tradition that dissents from religion that functions oppressively. Organic universalism is a form of universalism that usually arises up out of communities of historically marginalized and oppressed peoples. It is not a learned tradition, but rather an organic discovery. It develops when people learn that they were not born into original sin, but rather what the theologian Matthew Fox calls original blessing. Original blessing recognizes that life is a gift, that, in Fox's words, we do not enter into the world as blotches on existence, as sinful creatures, but we burst into the world as blessing. The future of our Unitarian Universalist faith lies in uncovering organic universalism. Now, our movement has never been particularly strong on evangelism. Many Unitarian Universalists I know go into a kind of anaphylactic shock when the term is mentioned. In a culture growing more diverse and more racially integrated, our congregations need to diversify if they are to survive. And embracing organic universalism helps us to connect to those who already share our religious values. This is a more difficult task than at first might appear. It requires us to examine our culture and crack it open in those places where it is not welcoming or inclusive. It challenges us to move beyond our comfort zones and recognize that we can share religious values with people, even if we do not share their culture. One glimpse of this, how hard this can be, one glimpse of how hard this could be a couple years ago, when the African-American poet Sonia Sanchez gave a talk at Ministry Days, the annual gathering of the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association. She began her presentation listing names like Harriet Tubman, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Martin King, June Jordan, Zora Neale Hurston, Octavia Butler, Miles Davis, Adam Clayton Powell, Nina Simone. Each name was followed by a click of her tongue. Now, the names ran at least 100 long, and the whole recitation lasted for more than 5 minutes. And I'll admit that this annoyed some of my colleagues. I remember one of them in particular, a white minister about my own age, was almost enraged by it. The list went on too long, he complained. It detracted from his experience of her poetry and added little to her message. My colleague's reaction was rooted in a lack of awareness of cultures other than his own. In some traditions, it's customary to begin a presentation with an invocation of one's lineage. Over the years, I've heard poets, musicians, activists, and yes, even some religious leaders do it. The practice reminds us of the line from the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Hebrews. We are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. Reading names brings that cloud of witnesses into the present. It reminds the speaker and the congregation that the speaker is but a representative of the community. Whenever I preach a sermon, around me, holding me up, are the spirits, the words, the thoughts, the love of all of those who have gone before me and paved the road that I now trod. This is true of every preacher, but it is not something that we Unitarian Universalists like to acknowledge. Much of our tradition, after all, is rooted in the illusion of the individual. To recognize our dependence on others reveals the tenuousness of that illusion. We are social creatures. Preaching is a social act. Religious experiences are experiences of connection. We are relational. The individual exists only alongside others. All of us are buoyed up by a cloud of witnesses. If our Unitarian Universalist tradition is to become the progressive and transformative movement that it has the possibility to become, then one of the things we must struggle with is who occupies our cloud of witnesses. We are always quick to claim our abolitionist and transcendentalist heroes, Aidan Ballou or Theodore Parker or Margaret Fuller. We like to lift them up as our own. We mention the involvement of Susan B. Anthony in our Unitarian churches. We celebrate our connections to presidents like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. But so often we fail to recognize the slaveholders, the misogynists, the colonialists, the imperialists, and even the outright white supremacists who share our lineage. So often we fail to acknowledge that men like Jefferson themselves were slaveholders. I invite you to contrast this morning Theodore Parker with Ezra Stiles Gannett. I suspect that many of you who have been coming to this or another Unitarian Universalist congregation will recognize Parker's name. His words are featured in our hymnal and repeated often in our congregations. Parker was one of the great orators in the Unitarian tradition. His words form a part of our national rhetoric. He inspired Martin King's phrase, "The arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." In Abraham Lincoln's words, "Government of the people, by the people, shall not perish from this earth." A militant 19th century abolitionist, he sheltered runaway slaves and helped arm John Brown for his raid on Harper Ferry. He preached radical religion and radical politics and built a congregation of many thousand. He was, however, cast out of the Unitarian establishment of his day. His fellow ministers refused to let him preach in their pulpits, and efforts were mounted unsuccessfully to drum him out of the Ministers' Association. Far more influential among the Unitarians of Parker's day was Ezra Stiles Gannett. Has anyone here actually even heard of him? Gannett was the minister of what is now the Arlington Street Church, one of our movement's most prestigious pulpits. He was one of the founders of the American Unitarian Association, one of the forerunners of our Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. and he served as one of that body's first presidents. He was also a staunch theological conservative. Well, at least as much of a staunch theological conservative you can be as a Unitarian. And he long sparred with Parker over political and theological issues. Their most famous dispute was over the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. The law dictated that escaped slaves must be returned to their so-called masters. Parker called for active, armed resistance to the law. He hated slavery and believed it immoral to allow anyone who had successfully escaped to be returned to bondage. Gannett, meanwhile, was a believer in law and order. He asserted that the Fugitive Slave Law, like all other laws, must be obeyed. Gannett's congregation included members of the Boston establishment, some of whom were charged with enforcing the Fugitive Slave Law. Parker's congregation contained some of the very people the law sought to return to slavery. The differences between the ministers and their congregations led Parker to proclaim, "A parishioner of my brother Gannett came to kidnap a member of my church." Gannett preaches a sermon to justify the Fugitive Slave Law, demanding that it should be obeyed, yes, calling on his church members to kidnap mine and sell them into bondage forever. Despite Parker's fiery rhetoric, the Unitarian establishment largely sided with Gannett. Partially as a result of Gannett's leadership, the American Unitarian Association failed to adopt any meaningful anti-slavery position. Today, we like to think of Parker as representing our tradition. But truthfully, it was Gannett, and not Parker, who best exemplifies Unitarianism of the mid-19th century. In order to be honest about our religious heritage, we need to acknowledge that men like Gannett are part of our clouds of witness. They built many of our liberal religious institutions, and they are just as much our religious ancestors as the abolitionists like Aiden Ballou we like to celebrate. As a religious movement, we are not without our faults. To pretend otherwise is to fail to address those faults. And if we are to do that, then we cannot seek to correct them. One of the things that needs to be acknowledged about most Unitarian Universalist theology is that it is white theology. Throughout the 20th century, there were only a handful of Unitarian Universalist or Unitarian Universalist ministers who were people of color. In the 19th century, as far as I'm aware, the number was precisely 0. These demographic facts mean that the majority of Unitarian Universalist theology is created from the perspective of whites. This is not something to be denigrated. It is something to be recognized. As the Black liberation theologian James Cone reminds us, theology cannot be separated from the community that it represents. Recognizing that most Unitarian Universalist theology is white theology accepts its limitations. It helps us as a movement develop a self-awareness of where we have been and where we need to go. And this is where the power and potential of what I've been calling organic universalism comes in. Unitarian Universalism may be a largely white theology, but organic universalism is not. Religious values similar to ours can be found among many communities. Unitarianism and Universalism, both with lowercase u's, are not the exclusive claim of Unitarian Universalists. Zora Neale Hurston demonstrates this beautifully in her short piece, Mother Catherine. Mother Catherine was an African-American religious leader in New Orleans in the 1920s and 1930s. She preached a radical universalism that held that every living thing was sacred. Hurston reports that throughout her services there were birds singing, dogs wandering about, and even a donkey that liked to respond to some of the hymns. Mother Catherine encouraged individuality rather than conformity. She accepted everyone, preaching, as Hurston recounts, "I got all kinds of children, but I am their mother. Some of them are saints, some of them are convicts and jailbirds, some of them even kill the babies in their bodies. Some of them walk the streets at night, but they's all my children. God got all kinds, so says the beautiful Spirit." This spirit of organic universalism can be found in other places unfamiliar to most white Unitarian Universalists. Two inspiring examples of the last decade come from the story of Carlton Pearson and the recent growth of Unitarian Universalism in Africa. Both cases are instances where people on their own discover the truth of Universalism and then recognize their theological kinship with our Unitarian Universalist Association. Pearson's name might be familiar to some of you. His story's been featured on the program This American Life and also on the television show Dateline NBC. For many years, Pearson was one of the most prominent African-American Pentecostal ministers. Preaching an orthodox theology of sin and salvation, he built his congregation in Tulsa, Oklahoma to many thousands. He was mentored by Oral Roberts and even had a program on the Trinity Broadcasting Network. One evening, Pearson had an epiphany while watching a television program about the genocide in Rwanda. Shocked by what he was seeing on television, he prayed to his God for clarity. God, I don't know how you can sit there on your throne in heaven and let those poor people drop to the ground, hungry, heartbroken, and lost, and just then randomly suck them into hell. Pearson reports that God replied to him, "We're not sucking those dear people into hell. Can't you see they're already there? We redeemed and reconciled all of humanity at Calvary." With those words, Pearson realized that everyone in the world is already saved, whether or not they are Christian, or Muslim, or Jewish, or Buddhists, or lesbians, or gays, or transgender, rich, poor, white, black, everyone, everywhere, already saved. When Pearson started to preach his new theology of universal salvation based on this vision, he called it the gospel of inclusion. He quickly found himself shunned by his fundamentalist religious colleagues. In short order, his community dropped to less than 1,000 members and lost its building. But Pearson could not stop speaking his truth. He found the local Unitarian Universalist community, All Souls, and after working with the senior minister there, merged his congregation with it. The result has been transformative for All Souls. The previously almost entirely white and wealthy community suddenly had a couple of hundred African-American Pentecostal Universalists in its midst. Worship changed as the music director from Pearson's church worked with the music director at All Souls to develop music that appealed to all congregants. All Souls went from being an almost entirely white congregation to being one of the most diverse multiracial ones in the country. In Africa today, organic universalism is also on the move. For many years, fundamentalists had engaged in an active evangelicism across the continent. Often they've preached a virulent form of Calvinism and taught that God condemns homosexuals and non-Christians to hell. This movement has been behind the anti-homosexual legislation in Uganda and has been linked to the assassination of the Ugandan gay rights activist Joseph Cato. One response to this spread of Calvinism has been the development of organic universalism. Starting in the late 1990s, Africans like Alice and Patrick Magara began to discover Unitarian Universalism on the internet. Patrick had trained as a non-denominational minister in Atlanta for 2 years before returning to Africa to preach fundamentalist theology. The theology he learned in school did not reflect his experience. Upon discovering Unitarian Universalism, he converted and began to spread the message of his faith. In dialogue with one of his African colleagues, Patrick Magara describes his faith. We stand as a family of love, peace, unity, and justice. We only believe in one God. We try to teach people to think for themselves, not to be excited by anybody else. We imagine Jesus as our brother, and we are all sons of God. We are all children of God. We are all members of the same human family. A message at the core of our Unitarian Universalist faith tradition and organic universalism wherever it appears. I find organic universalism to be powerful because it offers a vision of what our movement might yet become. Rob Hardy's, the senior minister of All Souls Unitarian in Washington, D.C., likes to say that the vision of his congregation is to embody the dream of the human family, whole, reconciled, not sundered by divisions of race, class, gender, or other human divisor. Organic universalism suggests that this vision is possible. It is possible because organic universalism demonstrates that our religious values have reached far beyond their current limits. But recognizing this truth and living into it are different things. I like the worlds of fiction and poetry because they stimulate my imagination of the possible. In some ways, after all, arts are better than reality because instead of starting from what is, they begin with what might be. There are numerous examples of organic universalism in works of literature. Joanne Braxton identifies Zora Neale Hurston as an organic universalist. For my part, I see organic universalism at work in the writing of Alice Walker and Octavia Butler. In her novel, The Color Purple, Walker writes, "Here's the thing I believe. God is inside you and inside everybody else. Such words are surely an expression of organic universalism." Butler's pair of novels, The Parable of the Sower and The Parable of the Talents, imagine the transformative power of organic universalism to change our planet and our species for the better. Set in a not-too-distant dystopian future, Butler tells the story of Lauren Oya Almina, the community she founds and the religion she creates to help humanity move towards a cooperative and vibrant future. Almina teaches that humanity's destiny is to take root amongst the stars. Rather than focus on competing over Earth's resources, people should work together to colonize other worlds. She believes humanity will achieve immortality not by clinging to superstitious beliefs about the afterlife, but by extending its reach far beyond our solar system. Almina preaches about God, a God who is change. God shapes and is shaped by humanity. We are part of God, and God is part of us. Almina's organic universalism expresses itself in her belief that we are born not with purpose, but with potential. The community she builds is multiracial and multi-generational. It shares many values with our contemporary Unitarian Universalism. It draws upon many sources. It's ecologically minded. It values cooperation over competition and affirms the worth and dignity of each individual. Most of all, it pushes its members to accept God is change. As Butler writes and Olmina preaches, God is change. Past is past. What was cannot come again. To survive, know the past. Let it touch you. Then, let the past go. To embrace the potential that organic universalism offers us means to embrace change and move beyond our comfort zones. It is to have the opposite reaction of my colleague when confronted with another culture. Instead of complaining about how the culture detracts from one's experience, embrace it and seek to understand it. Part of this change also means expanding our cloud of witnesses to include not just the Unitarians, the Universalists, and the Unitarian Universalists who preceded us, but the organic Universalists as well. It means saying that as members of this community, we stand not just with Theodore Parker, Aidan Ballou, Jane Addams, Yusei Barnwell, Abby Price, Margaret Fuller, James Luther Adams, and William Ellery Channing, but with Alice Walker, Joanne Braxton, Octavia Butler, Mother Catherine, Zora Neale Hurston, Carlton Pierce, and Alice and Patrick Magara as well. May it be so. Amen. Blessed be, and Ashe.